All right. So our next panel discussion is about Oregon statewide land use planning goal 1, citizen involvement. As many of you know, Oregon Administrative Rule 660-015-0001 goal 1 requires that local governments develop a citizen involvement program that ensures the opportunity for citizens to be involved in all phases of the planning process. Despite the explicit requirement of Goal 1 to involve a cross-section of affected citizens in all phases of the planning process, the people most impacted by local zoning laws that affect affordable housing production are often left out of that decision-making process. The people who make up the boards and commissions that take public input and those providing it typically are in a position of relative privilege that affords them the opportunity to engage in those local planning processes. And their preferences and opinions may not represent the needs and desires of everyone in the community. This panel will highlight the work of organizations seeking to change that narrative, maybe to update Goal 1, and center the voices of neighbors whose immediate struggles to meet basic needs can keep them from participating in a process that has no less bearing on their lives. Diana Cooper joins us from Brookings, Oregon, and they is the founder and executive director of Brookings Core Response in Brookings, Oregon. Her agency is just over 2 years old and has already grown to be a leading social service agency in Curry County, providing services for people without housing or who are precariously housed. Aside from walk-in services, they have now developed a wide variety of programs, including street medicine, resource navigation, medical respite, emergency shelter, transitional housing, low-income housing, and other health and housing programs. Diana has lived experience with homelessness and has over 10 years clean and sober. She has volunteered at various shelters and organizations in Jackson County and spent several years working in Medicaid services and healthcare. Diana also attends Portland State University, majoring in public health and minoring in business administration. She is a strong advocate for people without access to housing and has run for local office twice in the last 4 years. Jonathan Harker, AICP, him, is retiring after a 35-year career in city planning. The last 29 years with the city of Gresham. Jonathan has served many planning roles at Gresham, including in development, long range, natural resources, urban forestry, housing, and new communities. He served as a comprehensive planning manager, and at retirement was Gresham's urban design and planning director. He holds a master's of urban and regional planning from Portland State University. In retirement, he has been engaged in advocacy on climate and equity issues. Most recently, he served on the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities Rules Advisory Committee, representing the Oregon chapter of the American Planning Association, and is currently leading OAPA's Goal 1 Update project. Anna Hosley is the director of Storyline Community, part of the Levin Land and Housing Coalition, a collective of faith-based and community-based institutions engaging in the practices of community organizing to create housing equity in our communities, engage our neighbors, and leverage our resources to build affordable housing on faith land. To kick off our discussion, rather than jumping right into the presentations, I've been asked to ask a couple of questions, both of our panelists, but also from you. We're curious to know who's in the room. So all the lawyers, can you raise your hand? Let us know who you are. Thank you for joining us. How about all the planners? Lots of planners, awesome, thank you. Students, I know we have some students. Excellent, wonderful. Community organizers, who are my community organizers? Thank you all for joining us. I don't know what that means. Thank you all for joining us. I also wanted to start us, who did I miss? Developers, oh my goodness, yeah. I hope that we have a lot of this. So please, give us your questions, give us your thoughts. We're all here to learn from each other. And one of the first question I have of my panelists is, what are you hoping to leave? What are you hoping folks in this room, the developers, the lawyers, the planners, the students, the general public, the community organizers, what are you hoping that they're going to take away from today?
Want to start down here? Okay. So I'm actually really hoping that, because I come from a community where we really don't pay attention to our local government and what's happening until, you know, a bill comes out and we're like, why is this so high? What is this fee? So my hope is that people who are not paying attention, which it sounds like many of you are, I don't think, did we ask just general community at large? Is there anybody here that's just here to listen? And maybe one or two hands? Okay. So I'm hoping that people actually pay attention to their local government and start attending meetings and listening, because you'll hear some things that you had no idea are happening. And it's not even behind closed doors, but when I go to my meetings, there's typically just one person in attendance and it's media. So we miss a lot. So.
Oh, okay. I'll take my shot at it. So my hope for this session is that it tells you an abbreviated story of how Oregon's land use planning decision-making process fails to provide for equitable participation, which has and still does lead to inequitable outcomes related to environmental justice, racial justice, climate justice, health justice. Now, these impacts have and are affecting housing, productivity, affordability of housing, and are affecting equitable access to needed housing. And I hope that this session then inspires you to help remedy these failures by supporting OAPA's state legislative effort aimed at updating Goal 1, citizen participation in the 2025 session.
Jonathan is going to tell us all about the limitations of Goal 1, which I feel like I live out on a daily basis. So my hope for what we come away from today is an imagination to think beyond it. In organizing, we talk about living in the tension between the world as it is and the world as it should be. And I think that's the invitation I'd like to invite us into, to get a little bit creative about how we engage all of our neighbors in this process.
Okay, first we have Jonathan.
Well, good morning, and thank you for letting me attend this session. So unlike other presentations, not going to see any pictures. There's going to be a lot of text. May have mentioned I'm retired. So I kind of just put this together on my own. So a quick agenda for my presentation. First, I'm going to kind of give you some of the background of goals and Goal 1. Many of you will know you will maybe already heard this story, but I think it's important to understand what Goal 1 came from and how it has or hasn't changed in the last 50 years. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about this kind of what can be done in terms of how we might go about solving this process through legislation and, state sort of intervention into how all communities are doing participation. So real quickly then, and I'm going to bend this way a little bit. So there's 19 goals. Most of them were adopted in 1974. A handful were adopted in 75 and 76. The agency for doing planning in Oregon is the Department of Land Conservation and Development. Its commission is the Land Development, the Land Conservation and Development LDC. The rules and the goals themselves have legal authority. most of them are accompanied by guidelines, but these guidelines are non-mandatory. The goals are achieved by local government. That is, local government puts them into their comprehensive plans and implementing ordinances, zoning and such. And then these plans have to be consistent with the goals. Over time, LCDC has the authority and has amended the goals. Some of them. And when that happens, the local governments are required to update their comprehensive plans, just as they had to do when they were initially developed. Well, little bit about what are administrative rules, and this is an important part of the conversation. So administrative rules are an avenue when legislation is passed or an executive order is done by the governor to kind of put requirements around those policies that come out of legislation. LCDC has statutory authority to do rules, and for most of the goals, but not all of them, rules have been developed. Like the goals, the local jurisdictions have to comply with and change their comp plans and their zoning codes and the development codes, public facility plan codes, all those sort of things to be consistent with those rules. And the rules can be, done over time. So what is goal one? Well, there's the top part there. That's the text of goal one. Accompanying that text is 6 principles. There they are. Widespread citizen involvement, two-way communication. They all sound like really good things, and they are. They're all in the goal. They're all accompanied by 1 to 3 sentence paragraphs explaining the principles a little bit more. One exception to that is the first one, widespread citizen involvement, which requires this Committee for Citizen Involvement, a CCI. It was intended to be in the goal an independent body, and that's only what it did, is it was the one that made the initial community engagement plan, and then would be monitoring and keeping it up to date. But the rule also, or the goals also allowed the local jurisdiction to ask of LCDC to be either the governing body or the planning commission. And what you'll see in most jurisdictions today is it's the planning commission, who has, of course, a lot of other duties to attend to. So what is Goal One's history? Well, it was adopted in 1974. It's never been changed except for one word change. So when you look up, if you typed in, you Googled in Goal One, Oregon, you'll notice it will say amended in 1988, but that was just a change of this name. There are no administrative rules. I don't know if I talked about the guidelines. There are guidelines that are associated with most of the goals, but those are non-mandatory. The guidelines were intended to provide here's how you could do it to be able to be acknowledged by the state as being consistent with this goal. And when you look at codes today, and they talk about noticing and hearings, the types of applications, the development types, appeals, those sort of things. Those didn't really come from Goal One. Those come from other statutes. So that's that's the history of Goal One, right? It was adopted in 1974. So this fact that we have a nearly 50-year-old goal that was probably developed by people who looked much like me 50 years ago, has led to a lot of issues, or what we call shortcomings. And I want to kind of, somebody said that, a shout out to 1,000 Friends of Oregon, who put together this really well done public participation revisions recommendations in 2022. And a lot of these this text here is sort of adapted from that that document. And it just talks about some of the things that we're lacking today. The use of it, or it has it, a use of exclusive language. You notice that the title of it is citizen participation. Not public participation, but citizen participation. That's an important distinction. I think of who's intended to be able to be participating in our land use decisions. Again, it has no implementation standards. When it was written, the goals were written, they were intended to be able to be applied have flexibility for local jurisdictions, so that local jurisdictions could match the local community environment when they conformed with a goal. What this meant with goal 1, that first citizen participation plan, is that it's just all over the board, right? There was so much flexibility that, there's a lot of inconsistency when you go from jurisdiction to jurisdiction to jurisdiction about how they do citizen involvement. It doesn't address the techniques that you need to overcome barriers to public participation and in communication technology. It was written in 1974. It talks about meetings, it talks about newspaper, it talks about radio, and it talks about television. That's not today. And it doesn't talk about how difficult it can be for people to engage, what the barriers are, whether it's physical barriers, language barriers, cultural barriers, frightened of government barriers, and so forth. It doesn't have any mention of diversity, equity, inclusion. Those weren't in the principles, right? And it doesn't intentionally reach out. It doesn't have any mention of reaching out to the sort of historical and institutional practices that leave out a lot of our population. This list is adapted from, this list of historically and currently underserved communities adapted from the climate friendly equitable communities. One of the definitions in the new rules that were written, I think there was a little bit of talk about that this morning in the earlier panel. I'm just going to check my notes here. Sure I'm not missing something. Yeah, it just really just to think about who's not at the table when we make these decisions about these really critical decisions about land and land use. So I just wanted to, it also fails to address the issues of today. Racial justice, environmental justice, climate justice. The National American Planning Association has a pretty good guide out for planning for equity policy guide. And it talks about this quote: "It's important to recognize the past and present role that land use planning has played in creating and perpetuating practices that result in inequitable outcomes for underserved populations." Again, I kind of want to harken back to how these goals were developed and how goal 1 was developed and who developed it. And I would postulate it was mostly white men, because that's who did planning and that's who were making decisions in 1974. And so it shouldn't be a surprise to us if we haven't updated it or kept it current, that it just doesn't work for a lot of communities. At OAPA's conference this year, we had this speaker who talked about you can read the quote, but one of the things that I thought was interesting was this morning, as many organizations do, you acknowledge the lands. Who was here first, or who was here before us. But I think it's also, he suggested that you could also be acknowledging, or I brought up with him, the idea that you could also be acknowledging who's been displaced, who has been put into other, who has suffered, the past, in terms of, racial segregation and those sort of things, And so anyway, I just kind of like, I hope we're going to start thinking about these are sort of some of the issues. And finally, and this slide could be its own presentation. So this comes from the Equity and Zoning Policy Guide that APA put out in 2022. And as you read through this, these are like chapters in this book, in this policy guide. And if you read through those, let's just start about the people, equity and zoning procedures. So who's on advisory and decision-making boards? Who's writing and changing the zoning rules? Who's enforcing the zoning rules? Our participation process doesn't talk anything about those things. And it does impact the zoning we create and the maps we create. I think I was going to mention that many of you maybe followed the Governor Kotek's housing policy bill that passed this last session. And one of the elements that gave a lot of angst to planners was this provision for adjustments to zoning codes. And it's an awkward process. But a lot of the elements in those, the things like minimum parking, mandatory parking, maximum heights, maximum density, minimum lot sizes, lot coverages, those impact housing affordability. Those impact housing productivity. And I would say that they were, again, not considering everybody's needs. We also talk about things like architectural design standards, the sort of, I like to call the golden triangle, which is a requirement in Gresham's code. You have to comply with the golden triangle. Well, that doesn't fit for all cultures. We don't necessarily look at who's going to be living there. I think somebody asked that question. But we look at who's going to be living in these houses and how does it address that? And all these things add to the cost and the process and those sort of things. So that was the problems. Talk a little bit about this project that OAPA is wanting to do. And you can read the sort of paragraph that describes what our target is. I won't go over the reasons, we just talked about some of the reasons. This slide's up here is just to illustrate this sort of concept of why we're approaching it in the legislative process. LCDC has the authority to change the goal. It needs to be on their work plan, and it gets on the work plan either by legislation or by executive order, right? Either the governor tells them to do it or the legislator tells them to do it. In this case, we think we need to ask the legislator to do it with the governor's support. And of course, they need the funding to do the work. There were requirements for public hearings throughout the state, all the congressional districts, that's the sort of thing. So that's the point of this slide. That's the only color one I had. When I was doing planning at Gresham, one of the things that was pointed out to me is that not everybody can see colors. So we actually had to go to the part where we started doing graphs with lines through them, or dashes and that kind of thing, so that you could say not the red one, but the one with a checkered thing. Anyway, I digress. So I want to talk a little bit about some recent efforts that I think we could build on as we're trying to develop this concept and get support to build this legislation. So there's been a couple of bills that have been introduced and have some history. And there's also the climate friendly and equitable communities rulemaking. So House Bill 2488 You can see it was engrossed. They got out of committee. This bill, was originally a combination of two legislative concepts. One that was proposed by an organization called Beyond Toxics and the NAACP chapters of Portland and Eugene Springfield. It was to update Goal 1. The other was an LC that was proposed by a land use lawyer. Maybe many of you know Steve Schell. He's retired. Who it was to update the plan goals for climate. Those two bills came together, got a lot of support. The governor had money in the budget and her job to do it. We worked with her, worked with DLCD to come up with an amendment to match the money. It was going to go to a work session, and then climate was a trigger word. So that bill got taken off, but then a bill came back that was just public updating Goal 1, and that goal got out of committee. This is just a snapshot from the bill. It had included things. It had climate justice, environmental justice, equitable participation, underserved communities, all included in the bill. At the last regular session, this bill was introduced. It was a bill to address have Goal 1 address what they called environmental justice practices. So it was a more practical one. Unfortunately, it never got a committee hearing. It did get informational session. So there's some momentum. There's a little bit of momentum, right? You know, with got partway in 21 and 23. Coincidentally, both of these legislations would have required renaming Goal 1, public participation, or something that's not. So I'm not using exclusionary terminology. So then I'm going to talk about the climate-friendly, equitable community in this next couple slides. One of the things that I really appreciated about that rulemaking effort in DLCDs is I've been in a number of rulemaking advisory committees. They never looked like this rulemaking advisory committee. If you look up at the top there, you know, those are the usual people who you see on a rulemaking advisory committee at DLCD in the past, right? Cities and counties or other districts that are affected by the rule, metro, the legal cities, association of counties, some development, HBA, some realtors, and then, 1,000 Friends and OAPA. What you didn't see are this group, this bolded group. And this made a difference. It made an outcome of the CFAC rules. And I strongly believe that. And it was mentioned, I was on this rulemaking advisory committee. And so I've just pulled out a couple of, I've pulled out these next two slides are the text of the rules that were adopted for the climate-friendly and equitable community rules. These are in the transportation planning rule. So it described what an equitable outcome is and gave you a whole list of what they might be. And then it has some requirements. The first three bullets, the underserved populations, decision-making, equity analysis, those are things that are all required of jurisdictions when they either do certain things with their transportation system plan as required by the rule, or when they do some zoning that involves climate-friendly areas. These are all very specific. They're not for everything they do in planning, but just for these elements. So I'm not going to spend any more time much time on this at all. As we thinking about getting a bill, the first thing you have to do is get a legislative concept. And so some of these are some of the ideas that coming from past efforts that could be in that bill. And I know that you're going to all get copies of this slide presentation. So that's why I put so much text to it. So I'm going to stop there. And I'll turn it over to the next talker.
Thank you, Jonathan. I feel like that was such a thorough primer that I was taking really thorough notes and craning my neck a lot. So I want to talk about, as I said, these limitations mean we have to be creative and think outside of the current boxes. So I'm going to talk about some of the ways that we've done that in engaging neighborhoods in all the different parts of the process of building what our neighborhoods need. As Angel talked about and as Jonathan expanded on. Oh, and just a little context. Oh, I gotta use it. Okay,
Yeah, so
thank
you
you.
don't have to point out, you just did.
Oh, well, that's magical. Okay. So just a little context on me. I'm executive director of Storyline Community, which is part community of faith, particularly geared toward people who don't have justice of access to faith communities, and part community collective that helps neighbors know and meet the needs of their neighborhood. And we do that work in partnership with Levin Land and Housing Coalition. Has anyone heard of Levin Land and Housing? Oh, neat. Okay. This is a coalition of 50+ faith-based and community-based institutions who engage the practices of community organizing to leverage our resources to build affordable housing on faith land and to leverage the shared power of our voices to move our systems and our institutions toward deeper housing and racial equity. So in that work, what I found time and time again as like sort of a new project comes up where there's someone who wants to do something to meet the needs of their neighborhood, we kind of run into some of the limitations of goal one that came even before we got there sometimes. As Angel said, it invites us to engage a cross-section of affected citizens in all phases of the planning process, but it doesn't have any teeth, as Jonathan talked about. There's no standard for engagement or definition of who you need to engage or what they mean by citizen. So at the best, it presents a low bar. And at worst, I've seen that it can actually amplify the voices of those who already have power and privilege and stable housing to the detriment of those who do not. What I've found time and time again is that particularly public notices of land use planning and development tend to speak to the center of the system by default. They speak to those who are already in positions of leadership, have relational proximity to leadership in our local governments. They speak to those who speak English, to those who have privilege of margin time, and especially to those who own land. When we say we're going to give public notice to the neighbors of a housing project, what I've observed that to look like is that what we often mean is the property owners. So those who do not have stable housing are not given voice because they are not yet allowed to be neighbors, which creates this circle, a system that perpetuates itself. And this is deeply problematic, as we also talked about already, because we have a system that was built on racist zoning laws and exclusionary zoning laws. And because we've found that time and time again, in all call to a public meeting, I've just learned this the hard way so many times. We figured out how to do it differently in some ways. An all call to a public meeting tends to bring a disproportionate showing of people who are angry enough to show up. It brings a really reactive audience, and their voice then carries the weight of the room, which effectively means, especially around transitional or temporary housing options, that we have given landowners veto power over who their neighbors are. It means that we've given them veto power over solutions to what really is a public health crisis. And that showing also is not accurate. It's not an accurate representation of the whole. So it's skewing the work that we do. At both Storyline and then the Levin Land and Housing Coalition, we solve for this with a proactive and relational outreach approach. So instead of an all call from the seat of government that says, hey, come over here, whoever can hear me, which are the people close to me, what we do is we go to where the whole of our community is. This is the organizers in the room. There were a few of us will probably recognize this. This is the organizing spiral that we use. And it starts with up here in the upper right encounter, or listening, where we listen to the stories at the ground level through one-to-ones and house meetings. We also do deep canvassing. So we're having like meaningful conversations with all kinds of neighbors. And that allows us to step outside the center and get to the people who are really connected to the whole of our community and build engagement in that way. It also helps us to listen to shared pressures across the whole spectrum and help people weave that into a whole. So we're empowering in that process those who are not at the center to, as you go into this unveil and research and discern, to learn how their government works and understand the power of the system and where it is, both in official ways and all the unofficial ways that power take place. We teach people how to power map is what we call it, which is my favorite thing to do because it's really fun. And it helps them to know how to show up. Actually, it puts them on equal footing with that system that does not center them. And then here in the action phase, we help people learn to tell their story so that people will listen and to say, yeah, that story matters to who we're becoming. We also solve for that sort of reactive tendency by engaging our neighbors and listening to each other. It's not just one-way communication between citizens and like an expert collecting data. We find when we engage neighbors and listening to each other's story, it completely changes what's possible because it's like together we can begin to weave a picture of the greater whole that the folks in the room didn't have before. The truth is that for each of us, what is good for me is inherently bound up in what is good for my neighbor. So if my neighbor's roots aren't getting the nutrients they need, either are mine because we share the same soil. And our engagement processes are kind of an invitation to get in that soil together. One of the ways that we do that is through these are like housing boards that we've created to tell the story of housing. So we'll go into a community that we're working in, and it's a little hard to see here, but it's shaped like a house and you can walk through it and interact with it. And this is, I think the city of Milwaukee, something, you were there. Your picture is in there, actually. That's really fun. I didn't notice that till now. Okay. This is the Oak Grove Trolley Trail Fest. And here's kind of some close-ups of our boards. You can't really study them here, but I will give my website if you would like to see them more closely. What we do with this is that we don't just like give people information, we invite them to interact with it, to say as they see this whole story that covers really the way the entire housing spectrum. Often housing conversations hyper-focus on those who live outside, and what that sometimes does is pull us away actually from the whole system that created this. And what we found is that people, as they see sort of how we got where we are, they start to see themselves in it. One of these, I think this one over here, talks about the definition of rent burden. And I can't tell you how many people have come through this display and read that board and been like, and is there to be like, yes, let's help homeless people. And they read that board and are like, you see them doing the math in their head and being like, wait, 30%. I'm rent burdened. And then all of a sudden it like sort of pulls the veil back where they're like, wait, so does this apply to me? Is that why like I'm nervous to go to the dentist because I'm so close to the edge all the time? And as soon as you see yourself in the story, it changes how you see the whole story. We also ask people to like sometimes put a little sticker where they see the story of someone they care about, and it connects them to that greater whole. It also gives us a roadmap. So when we get closer to the stories of all of our neighbors, we create a roadmap for needed legislation change. As I said before, our goal is to live in that tension of the world as it is and the world as it should be. So as we practice this thing that Goal 1 hasn't caught up with, we're creating a map that can change how we move forward as a whole. I'm going to give you a couple examples of that. In 2017, this is sort of the origin story of the Love and Land and Housing Coalition that walked through this pathway with people in their own neighborhood. So they began because they wanted to listen to their neighborhood and actually the people in their own church community as well. And they listened to Luce, an immigrant who had been displaced time and time and time again because of the cost of housing, uprooting her kiddo from stable community time and time and time again, every year or two. And they found a solution. They did this sort of listening process. They did some research. They were like, actually, we have the means within our community to solve this problem. We're going to put a tiny house on like actually one extra property someone has they aren't using in their own private property. And what they found is that they couldn't legally do that. So in the midst of a housing crisis, where the government entities were like, we're in a housing crisis, we don't have enough housing, they were not allowed to solve the problem in their own community. And that led them to organizing the rest of the cycle and changing the law. They moved the city of Portland at that time to hear this story and declare a moratorium on the evictions of tiny houses on private property. And it was soon thereafter that Portsmouth Union Church listened to their neighbors and also wanted to be a part of solving the problem in their own community by building affordable housing for veterans on their land. But they ran into zoning barriers that were insurmountable. So again, with Senate Bill 8 and House Bill 2008, we changed the law to allow faith institutions to develop affordable housing on their land without being hampered by unnecessary and unhelpful conditional use requirements. So because PUC listened to their neighbors, it unlocked the capacity for all faith institutions in the state of Oregon to do the same. It made that roadmap. So right now we're beginning development on in several spots like Barbie's Village, which is a project that came out of listening to our Indigenous neighbors and compelled the Presbyterian denomination to give land back to the Indigenous-run Future Generations Collaborative to build a tiny home village and early childhood center for our unhoused Indigenous neighbors. And we have another site that listened to the need for intergenerational housing for seniors and families together, and another site who's building housing for immigrants and asylum seekers in their neighborhood. So I'm about to hand it to Diana. I will leave with just an ask. One of the core values in this organizing work is a belief that what we need is here, that everything our community needs to thrive, it already exists, and we just need to walk toward it. So on that vein, I'm going to tell you what we need to do this work well, because it feels like a good room to do that in. Our coalition would love to, those people who walked right into the trap of raising their hands saying they're lawyers, that's something our coalition really needs greater and deeper relationships with. So if you're intrigued by that, please come talk to me. And also we need pre-development funding to do this kind of outreach work that extends really to the full breadth of what Goal 1 should be doing. And we're currently working on legislation to make that possible. If you're interested in that, please let me know. And Diana.
Hello. So I actually kind of suggested the order, and one of the downsides to going last is that I probably need to speak a little quicker, although I'm pretty adept at that. But one of the upsides is I kind of got to listen to them, and so maybe adjust a little bit. So here's the clicker. Did I just? Oh, great. Am I going the wrong way?
Yeah, the right side.
There we go. Just had to go through a little bit more. So I am Diana. I guess the picture didn't show up. It was just a picture of me. Don't worry. So my name is Diana Cooper. I am the founder and executive director for Brookings Core Response in Brookings, Oregon. I am a 4th generation Curry County resident, so my family's been there a long time. Hopefully some of my children will stick around if we make it a better place for them. I was born and raised in Brookings. Some of you, probably nobody here knows what's in Brookings unless you vacationed there. There's no hospital. So I was actually born at home in Brookings. I'm pretty much as local as it can get. And I put a map up here because, although it's kind of far down, I'm not sure if everybody can see it. So if you don't know where Brookings is, it's in Curry County. If you don't know where Curry County is, it's below Coos County. And if you still don't know, Brookings is on the coast. It's 20 minutes above California. I'm pretty sure everyone here knows where California is at. So it took me a while to get here yesterday. We're very rural. It's a fairly conservative area. I think it's probably 60 to 70%, depending on where you're at. And there is a lot of public land in Curry County that is undeveloped. So our industries for Curry County is tourism, fishing, logging, forestry, farming, and agriculture. Most of those have to do with seasonal work. And so we have a lot of people living in poverty in Curry County just because of the lack of productivity that we often have and how much we focus on the tourism industry, which can be a huge burden to housing. And I'm going to speak to that here in just a minute. So my experience and why I'm up here, I actually, when I got invited here, I was like, I'm not really sure because I don't know anything about goal 1. And then I started reading and learning about goal 1. And I thought, oh, I think maybe I'm here to talk about how bad it can be. I'm sorry, I'm not the one bringing the solutions today. I actually really appreciate all of the people in this room and in our metropolitan area for bringing solutions to the state, because we're one of those communities that requires the state to have a heavy hand in our government. We don't have a local public health, which is a great thing. During the pandemic, that was taken away and the state took over. And I'm saying this because this is the MO in our community, is the state coming in and taking over and enforcing what needs to happen because our local government won't, and we end up suffering. So my lived experience is, or my lived expertise is, I was homeless for 9 years in Curry County, and I had to leave my community to get help. I left and I went to Jackson County, and I got into treatment and got into housing. And then I started school at Road Community College. And I started volunteering in nonprofits and getting involved. And then I started realizing how little we had in Curry County. So I moved back to start this organization. The pandemic hit, and here we all are. A lot's changed in 4 years. So this is my organization and some of my staff. We do provide a lot of walk-in services. We started with outreach based because we didn't have a building. Then we got a building and we started with walk-in services. Then people wanted longer term services, so we started developing case management. And then we realized housing and healthcare, while they're very interconnected, really require a lot of different rules and a lot of different funding and programs. So we've developed into housing case management programs and health case management programs. We have become probably the largest social service organization in just a few short years in Curry County. And we probably have some of the largest funding at this point, which is still fairly small. And something that differentiates us from many other agencies that serve our community is we're pretty much the only one that's based in our community outside of St. Timothy's Church, which I'll also talk about here in a minute. But mostly all of the services we receive are based outside of our community. So let me see, I may want to wait for that one, although that's kind of the exciting one. So I'll just briefly talk a little bit about the lack of equitable opportunity for involvement in Curry County. And again, I'm definitely not bringing very many solutions. I'm kind of here to tell you, some of the things you guys were talking about before, like, well, our developers are having a hard time with zoning. And I'm like, you guys have developers? And you're like, our city councilors are having a hard time getting things through. And I'm like, you have counselors that are willing to do that? So you guys are way ahead. And this is maybe some of your history before it became a little more diverse. So Brookings has, Brookings specifically, both city, county, and our district level, we have a lack of people that look like me, sound like me, and people that don't look like me that are more diverse than me. And so we basically just have this homogenous group of people leading our local government, and it stays that way all the time. We can never get anyone new in. I've tried, I ran for council twice. Every time I had someone run against me just to stop me, and it worked. I even had people run not against me, just in case I did get in, they could get in another position and stop me. So apparently I'm very powerful. So well, I haven't got up there yet, so. So in Brookings, we have 4 city councilors that are appointed, that were not elected, out of 5. And how that happens is we had a recall recently. 3 of our counselors, we were able to recall very successfully. It was quite a landslide. And what they did was they each dropped 1 off at a time and voted a new person in. And they just did that until it was all, they just appointed new people. So we never got a vote. And apparently that's legal somehow. So 4 of our 5 city councilors are unelected. 2 of our 3 county commissioners are unelected, same way, they got appointed in. Both our state representative and our state senator are unelected. So we have no public representation. We have no representation from anyone. All of those groups that Anna was showing, you know, BIPOC, queer, just anybody that isn't older white male typically. We don't have that kind of representation in Curry County. Nobody looks and sounds like me at all. And I also, you know, obviously work with a lot of people who are without housing. There's nobody even that fits into the category of low income that's in any of our groups. And so I say that because this is also directly reflective of what's on our planning commission. I looked up the planning commission notes from the last meeting and the city council meeting that's going to be going on Monday, because I knew there was going to be something I could use. I just did this maybe an hour ago. I knew there was going to be something I could use to talk about. We just had a planning commissioner step off and a new one voted in the same day. I didn't even know that happened. And that's the second one in a month. So we don't hear about it. We don't. And if we do, and we get our application in, we don't get voted in. So this really limits the voice that's in the room, that's leading these discussions. The Planning Commission is our group that is supposed to be the public or the citizen input. And we can't get in the room. We're not friends with the people already in the room. So the lack of diverse representation, I don't think I need to tell you guys what that brings to the table. It's really ends up limiting the experiences that are involved in decision-making, and it ends up leading to a lot of groupthink. It also ends up stopping a lot of the voice of opposition. If somebody did want to say, actually, I don't agree with this, they probably wouldn't, not in our community. All right, we'll get to the fun one. So Brookings has actually made national headlines a few times. So if you haven't heard of Brookings, you might have heard of some of these situations going on. This is just a snippet of just the headlines, and this is just a few, there's a lot that have sort of precipitated and are currently going on with a lawsuit against the city of Brookings from a church. So St. Timothy's is the church that our organization was born from. I started working there in April 2020 and immediately recognized the need for some non-religious services there as well alongside. Also, they're in the city of Brookings, and we wanted to operate outside the city for some of the reasons I already mentioned. So this right here, I'm going to try to talk without losing the mic. So back in 2021, the city voted to limit how many days a week a church could feed. And that was in the middle of Delta. I also started a COVID testing clinic in the basement of this church. So we were seeing hundreds of people a day coming from all over, from hundreds of miles to this testing clinic. We feed people constantly. Brookings is one of the few places that has 7 days a week feeding in just most of rural Oregon. And so when the pandemic hit, a lot of the churches closed their doors. St. Timothy's opened up to 6 days a week. That caused a lot of issues with the neighborhood. And we actually this is the official name of the petition. It was a petition to remove the homeless from St. Timothy's. That's the name of the petition. And it did enact and move forward some of these some of these new laws that are now on our books. So that was passed. St. Timothy's fought it. They filed a lawsuit. That there was an appeal at Planning Commission of that ruling, or of the abatement. So there's actually technically two lawsuits, and this kind of gets confusing, so I'll try not to mix it up. But essentially, St. Timothy's filed a lawsuit against the city for just enacting it, saying it was a violation of their rights. And then during this lawsuit, which is now, I mean, a federal lawsuit at this point, during the middle of this lawsuit, the city of Brookings also served them with an abatement about a year later for not following it. So now they're going to sue on that abatement as well. So there's going to be two major lawsuits going on just with this alone. So this is kind of one of the major cases that I wanted to highlight, but there's quite a bit more that I'll get to, and I'll be kind of brief. I already spoke to that, I think. No, so people build a culture within systems, and that culture directs how our laws are made and who they benefit. I don't think I have to explain this one too much, but essentially whoever's at the table when the law is written, that law usually stays on the books for a long time. It's so much harder to get a law repealed than it is to stop it before it makes it there. And at this point, it's kind of green light ahead on any laws that restrict services in our community. So we have ended up with, I've been going to the city for probably 5 years, watching meetings pretty consistently. And in December of 2020, there was a law put on the books that you cannot sleep inside your vehicle in city limits. And when I spoke with the mayor at that time, he essentially said, well, it's kind of business as usual. We've been doing it this way. We're just codifying it. And I said, no, it is a big deal. Once you get it on the books, it's a big deal. So that did pass. It has already displaced so many people that we now can't track, and they lose services. All right, I kind of jumped around here. Who isn't at the table and why? Well, I'm not at the table, that's for sure. I actually also applied when they were appointing people, even though I disagreed with the appointment. I applied to just to see what the process was. So I've actually tried 3 times to get on council. I think that the biggest reason why we can't get on council or why we can't get involved in planning commission is because we're not invited to the table, and the table is, it's not even that it's set in a way that is unhelpful, it's harmful for us to even try to come forward. And so we just don't make it on there. We don't get representation. Okay. I did skip a little bit here. So I was going to talk about the theory versus the reality. What we learned from Project Turnkey, which I think actually this is probably the reason why Sam brought me here, is to tell you about this catastrophe that was Project Turnkey, and what we learned from it. So I've been championing Project Turnkey. I'm sure most of you know about Project Turnkey. So I've been championing that since the beginning of, I think, late 2020 when I heard about it. And I knew we weren't going to be able to get the project ourselves because we don't have the infrastructure. So we tried to get another agency to get it, and they weren't able to. So we got a second one. And while we were working with that second agency, I was able to get our mayor at the time to write a letter of support, not the city, but the mayor. He had kind of come full circle, and we talked a lot, and he started opening up to why we needed these services here. So he actually wrote a personal letter of support. We kept it quiet. And shortly before the decision was made by OCF, which we didn't get the project at that time, the rest of the council heard about the letter. And they brought it to the meeting, and they spent 20 minutes berating him for this letter and calling out his ethics. And then they voted to force him to write a letter of opposition. So he resigned the next day. That was one of our major lessons, was that we had quite a bit of an uphill battle. So when we talk about public participation in these housing adventures, the next thing that happened was another agency came forward and said, we're willing to take on the project. And so we ended up, the city asked us to do a town hall, which I will never do again. And at the town hall, essentially we spent 3 hours being yelled at by community members. So last night when we had the dinner, I said something and I heard some gasps that I would like there to be no public participation in these processes. And I think we're here to do exactly the opposite of that. But in my community, that has been really harmful. And what we're doing, as someone with lived experience out there, what we're doing is we're saying, unless the people who have suffered the most can bear the burden to come to these meetings and give input, and how do they even find out about these meetings? We're not going to move forward with projects that help them. We cannot put that burden on people who are already displaced. They've been underserved. They don't trust leadership. We have to just acknowledge that there's a housing need and move forward. And let's see, where am I at on time here? Okay, I'll probably go quick so that we can get at least a few minutes for question. We also have a housing complex that we're building in, actually it's a motel we're converting in Gold Beach. And that's about 30 minutes north of us. And the reason why we chose Gold Beach is because we knew we weren't going to be able to get this off the ground in Brookings. So I can't even bring forward a housing project in my own community that I was born and raised in because of people who moved from outside the community and took positions of leadership. And the last thing I'll mention on this is we are a tourism town when it's convenient. And that's usually convenient when we're talking about housing and land use. So we went from 20, which I know this seems small, but we have like 7,000 people in our town. So it's pretty small as it is. We went from 20 short-term rentals in like 20 years before the pandemic to we now have over 80 in just the last few years. And the reason for that is when we had our executive orders and we shut down travel and we shut down short-term stays and motels, investors saw that as a good opportunity to slide under the radar, and they purchased all of the housing that they could turn to short-term rental and just didn't get it signed off. They didn't get their conditional use permits until after that those restrictions were lifted, but people were traveling and using that. So now we have like this explosion in short-term rentals, and Brookings is now seen as this great destination place for vacations, but the people living there and working in those vacation rentals can't afford to live there. So I know this probably doesn't help as much with, again, what you should do, but I did want to mention, so advocates, if you're not already involved, which I assume all of you are, get involved and start going to meetings and listening. Community members, listen to meetings, run for office. Legislators and lawmakers pass laws that increase participation. And I think that there is this fear of dissent. Conflict is not negative. Obviously, we can be productive when we're talking, but conflict in of itself is very productive. And so I think we need to bring those people to the table. We do talk a lot about nothing about us without us. And I also want to mention, what can you do that's not nothing? So that's what I ask my legislators. That's what I ask my city councilors when they're like, well, what can we do? What can you do that's not nothing? Thank you.
Thank you for informing, for inspiring and calling us to action. You know, Diana, your experiences, although unique to you, repeat themselves. You know, it's a pattern. We see it across the state. I see a lot of head nodding. I look for that in a room. I'll say that a lot. I look for the folks in the back of the room, like sort of nodding their head, because a lot of times this is what public participation in communities looks like. It's that town hall that you talked about, where you've got this adversarial kind of process. It's like it's already set up, it's already established in the way we set up the room. And so I want to, I mean, I think Anna, some of the some of the things that you do in your community organizing are real lessons that policymakers, that, city councils and county commissioners and local planning bodies, they could be doing that. They're not required to, but they could be doing more of that. And so I want to maybe ask the questions to, to each of you, like what could that look like? What could it look like? Just, instead of setting it up a room like this, what could it look like? What would it take to make it more inviting, to make it a safer place for people to engage? What does that look like?
Start, speak to that.
Sure. It is really intimidating going to our city council and asking things of them. Because, they're not required to speak back to us and they often don't. It's intimidating going to planning commission meetings and trying to have these conversations. Because we know that there's a lot of people there already that just hate us and don't want us there. And so my opinion on how, it's hard for me to speak to this because we don't have anyone that wants us there. So if they did, and how could they make it more inviting to us, is we need to see them making movements to take some of these barriers out of the way. We need to see that this is a place where we can go. And so we need to hear that when they're talking about initiatives they want for the city. We want to hear about we want to hear them use the word homelessness. We want to hear them talk about planning and development in a way that makes it sound like they're waiting for us, because that's not, it's almost hard for me to speak to this one because I just can't even imagine.
Well, Anna, it seems like your organization has taken this into your own hands. The county commission isn't coming to you. So you're going to you're bringing the conversation to your community.
Yeah. And I would say, our current local county commission isn't always a fan. If you are in a place where you're like local government who is a fan of public participation, I would say knowing that so often you're not going to get the whole in the room, I would say go outside the room too. Say like invite people into that space. And actually something we do as community organizers is in any room, we listen and notice, and just the way you described, and then take further steps. Like see who pops out that's like, actually, they have a story that's underrepresented in this room, and set up a one-to-one with them, invite them to deeper interaction around it so that all the work isn't happening in that room. Actually, it's sort of like a springboard.
You're going to the library. You're meeting someone at a playground, and you're bringing those stories then back to the hearing room.
Yeah, I can't tell you how to do things tomorrow. Tomorrow on Saturday. I do think that institutions have to change. The institutional structures have to change. My career in planning, I know that change came because we kind of got told to do things. The form of the Portland metro area looks the way it does because decisions were made in the early 90s to hold the urban growth boundary, create centers and all those sort of things, and integrate the transit and that sort of stuff. But that happened because because conflict was allowed to happen. People were allowed to talk about it, and then came up with a decision about how the greater region should look. So I would argue that, let's change the law. Let's change the way we do things. Let's make it so that, during the pandemic, my great story is, my son introduced me to a girlfriend in the spring of 2020, and well, yesterday I was babysitting or taking care of a 14-month and 26-month-old grandchildren. I want those grandchildren to be able to feel comfortable when they when they engage in land use or anything, and they don't. Yeah, so I would hope what I would ask is, if you're a law firm, if you're an organization, if you're an individual, contact me, get engaged in helping us. There's a lot of work to do to get the legislation changed. But it happens through people participating. And so I would ask you to, grab my email, talk to me during the day, and kind of get on board with helping us do something in 2025 next session.
You mentioning your grandchildren actually is a perfect segue into the question that we have online. Could a revised goal 1 somehow factor in future Oregonians, that is our future children to the 7th generation and global climate refugees or other immigrants, for example? These groups are often impacted by land use decisions as much as people alive today.
Yes. I mean, the simple answer is that's, we pay the consequences for what we do. We don't often pay them. I'm not going to pay them probably, but generations of people paying for it. We made a decision about how we did things 50 years ago, 100 years ago. In another panel similar to this one, I heard a presentation about West Eugene. You guys probably all know East Eugene really well. That's where the downtown is. That's where the university is. West Eugene is a place that was formerly an area with sunset law, right? So Eugene had a sunset law, and this is where you lived, in the swampy area that later became Eugene. Today, it's surrounded by industrial land, creating a great amount of health problems. We make, so we have to change the way we do things. And the way we do that in a lot of ways is we institutionalize it. We have a state planning program. Let's make that state planning program work for everybody.
Can I just mention too, there's a saying that says, the best time to influence the life of a child is 100 years ago.
I agree with that.
We have a question.
So these are just a few reflections of the shift to a statewide push for land use planning now. All the sort of state, tell us what to do because we need your help. And Sam mentioned in the last panel his cry for help to comment on housing production strategies. And I guess my comments are a little bit targeted to DLCD because I know there's a lot of you in the room, and there is a way to do this better. These housing production strategies are about affirmatively furthering fair housing, and one local government reached out to HLA. And we are a volunteer board member that cares about this issue, but no one else has reached out to us who, like, we're helping you help yourselves kind of a group. And so we're not even the marginalized populations that are being targeted with these rules and the people that are trying to be helped. So something different has to happen as we move forward with these housing production strategies. And then tangentially, I'm working on a case that involves a treaty tribe. And during that process, it's not housing related, but the DLCD Goal 5 Cultural Resources RAC was being formed. And this tribe said, we never even heard about this. They weren't invited to the table, or if they were invited, they weren't invited in a culturally respectful way, because a public notice, like you guys have been talking about, that goes to a bunch of people once is not targeted culturally specific outreach. And so by the time I forwarded the notice that I received, because I'm on DLCD's list, the RAC had already been chosen. And so that's a big problem because that's not a big group of treaty recognized tribes. Sam acknowledged them at the beginning of this meeting. And so, yeah, the law hasn't changed on Goal 1, but we can do better. We don't need a law change. We can do better now. And we ought to be, especially if the state is going to take over land use planning, they got to do it better. And I know it's happening fast for a bureaucracy, but it's just got to be better.
I would just yes, to everything you just said. And I would add on again that takes resources. And we've been trying to get pre-development funding for exactly that work, and it just keeps following through. And I'm not sure why that's happening when there is this big push that could change things at large scale. So jump into that conversation too, please, everyone.
I'm also always concerned when government's making decisions about a group of people and none of them are at the table. That's not a healthy way to make decisions.
Is it safe? Oh, it is safe. Okay, great. I really, as a grassroots organizer from the East Coast, I really adore this strategy on like bringing folks into the fold. One thing I feel like a suggestion for us in this region who's really afraid of public displays of accountability and transparency is really working with folks with lived experience and centering them in the middle of these conversations. And I think specifically to your point of being raised in Brookings, but not being able to engage in what is happening in your specific community speaks directly to this aspect. I think something else for us to consider when working with folks who are in lived experience, navigating through something that's happening, is what are we doing to uplift them, right? We're not just saying come to this meeting because that meeting might be the thing that is keeping someone from a dollar amount to pay their rent or to be able to survive, right? And so as we're engaging with our communities, we need to be thinking about what are we doing to sustain our communities beyond asking them to come into a space that is not trauma informed, that does not consider them, that does not center their experience, but rather tokenizes it. So I think something for us to all consider in conjunction with the what can we all do is really thinking about how we are interacting with our communities and who needs to hold the power to interact to shift the culture that we need to be shifted or to shift the change that we need to see happen. And then I really also enjoyed you saying like, we would rather the government come in and tell us what to do sometimes versus navigating, dealing with some other folks in our specific community to help make that happen. And I think that that is a really great strategy because sometimes it means that you are saying, okay, I don't trust this space to make it happen for me, but I want to hear what our government, like you said, what are you going to do that's not nothing? And then that way I can poke holes in it if you make suggestions that don't make sense. And I think that that to me was like chef's kiss. So I just want to appreciate you for saying that.
I really love everything you just said, and I think you speak to the need to show up with each other as a coalition, as a body. In Clackamas County, there's been this outright contingent of like Proud Boys showing up to BCC meetings and school board meetings with physical intimidation, and it intimidates people out of the room. And the only way to stand up to that is to show up together and not put someone in that vulnerable position.
Thank you all so much. I'm being told lunch, I think, is here. I hope you all continue to have these conversations. I know most of us will be sticking around. So thank you again to our panelists.